Most of us experience stress on a regular basis for a variety of reasons. When you're stressed and worn out, where do you go? What's your happy place where you can relax and unwind? Maybe it's not a place, maybe it's an activity. Think about that for a moment. This morning I want to take a little different approach to the message, hopefully so that you can enter into it. This being a Communion Sunday, we missed it earlier in the month because of supplies. We're going to observe the Lord's table together in just a little bit. And the story that I want us to enter into out of Mark 6 connects to the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to ask you to participate. Certainly feel free not to participate, but I'll guide you through that as we go along. Jesus had sent the disciples out on a mission trip. They returned, and the story picks up on their return. Mark 6, beginning in verse 30. The disciples gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. But there were so many people coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. And Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went with Jesus by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. And many who saw them leave recognized them, and they ran on foot and got there ahead of them. When they landed, Jesus saw the crowds, and his heart was broken, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. It was already late in the day, and the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a remote place, and it's getting late. Send the people away so that they can go into the countryside and into the villages and buy themselves something to eat." And Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." That would take more than 6 months of our pay. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they came to him and said, "We have 5 loaves and 2 fish." Jesus directed the disciples to have the people sit down on the green grass in groups. So they sat down, the people, on the grass in groups of hundreds and 50s. Then Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to the disciples and had them distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish among them as well. And they all ate and were satisfied. Then the disciples gathered up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish, and over 5,000 people ate on that day. So this is the participation part. I'm going to ask you to discuss with one another, the people sitting next to you. If you're at home and are viewing on your own, feel free to use the chat box there on Zoom. And if you're here, if you want, you certainly don't have to participate, but you want to connect with somebody and you're distant, put your mask on and draw a little closer and answer this question. What surprised you about this story? I'll give you 1 minute. Go. 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to tell you the story again, but before I do that, a couple observations about what's going on here. First, it's about 18 months to 2 years into the ministry of Jesus. The disciples have been following him around, and Jesus decides it's their turn. So he gives them authority to go out into the countryside to proclaim the good news, to heal the sick, and to cast out evil. And when they return, they give this report to Jesus. But in between, they're going out and they're coming back. Mark sandwiches the beheading of John the Baptist. It's one of Mark's signature moves to sandwich things, events or episodes in between one another. And he does that, I think, particularly in this case, with beheading of John the Baptist, as a way of highlighting not just the glamour and power of discipleship, i.e. you go out, you preach, you heal, you proclaim, there's crowds, there's excitement, but there's also a cost. And that John the Baptist loses his life because of his faithfulness to the Father. And as one scholar, Ralph Martin, put it in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark, he suggests that Mark presents this sandwiching of the beheading of John the Baptist between the sending out and the return of the disciples as a way of saying that John the Baptist is not just a forerunner for Jesus, but that John is a forerunner for us as well. And he highlights the cost of discipleship. A key phrase in this narrative is that Jesus sees the people as a sheep without a shepherd. It's a way in which Jesus connects his own ministry to that of Moses and David, Elijah, and the suffering servant out of the book of Isaiah. Moses, when he was the people were about to enter into the promised land, and Moses wasn't going to go in, but he had to find a successor who would lead the people. And he prays that the Lord would raise up a leader who would guide the people so that they wouldn't be like a sheep without a shepherd. And David, of course, in the line of King David, comes as the fulfillment of God's promise that he himself would be their shepherd. There's also a connection to the Eucharist, which we'll see in a little bit. But the whole context sets us back into the wilderness scene where Moses feeds the people with manna from heaven. Jesus here in this story, he takes the loaves, he blesses them, he breaks them, and he gives them away. It's a repeated formula which shows up again at the Last Supper. So hear now the word of the Lord. The disciples gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. But so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have time to eat. So Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went with Jesus by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Many who saw them leave recognized them and ran on ahead of them by foot through all the towns and got there ahead of them. When they landed, Jesus saw the crowds, and his heart was broken, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. It was already late in the day, and the disciples came to Jesus, and they said, "Lord, this is a remote place, and it is already late. Send the people out to the countryside and to the villages so that they can buy themselves something to eat. And Jesus said, you feed them. But what? That would take more than 6 months of our pay. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? Go see. They came back and reported that they had 5 and 2 fish. Jesus directed them to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So the disciples had the people sit in groups of hundreds and fifties. Then Jesus took the bread, gave thanks for it, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples to give to them. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Then they all ate and were satisfied. Over 5,000 people ate that day. This is the word of the Lord. So, a question for you to discuss. What is Jesus saying to you through this story? You can discuss that with someone next to you, or you can just meditate on yourself, or for those folks joining us by Zoom, you can put that in the chat box. You have 2 minutes. Go. Thirty seconds. Okay. At the risk of overplaying my hand, I'm going to tell you the story one more time. But you're enjoying the sun, right? And the warmth and the fellowship. Mark 6, verse 30. Hear now the word of the Lord. The disciples gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. So many people were coming to them and going that they didn't even have an opportunity to eat. So Jesus said, "Come with me. Buy yourself to a quiet place and rest." So they went with him by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Many who saw them leave recognized them and ran on foot through all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed, he saw the crowds and he had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he taught them many things. The disciples came to him and said, "Lord, this is a remote place and it is already late. Send the people away so that they can go into the countryside and into the villages and buy something to eat." And Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." What? Lord, this would take more than 6 months of our pay. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go see." When they found out, they reported to him 5 and 2 fish. So Jesus directed them to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So the disciples had the people sit in groups of 100 and in groups of 50s. Then Jesus took the bread and he gave thanks for it. He broke it and he gave it to his disciples and said, "Distribute this among the people." Then he also divided the fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. More than 5,000 of them were there on that day. It's the word of the Lord. Hang on. I'm coming. There we go. In light of this story, how might you live differently this week? I've been through the story probably 100 times this week alone. And it's the first time this week that I was struck by the reality that the challenge here for the disciples may not be their lack of resources in light of the magnitude of the problem facing them, but rather the challenge might be their very willingness to take up responsibility for the crowd itself. Jesus feeds the multitude using the fourfold formula that we use in just a moment for the celebration of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. He uses the same formula when he feeds 4,000 in another chapter. It's the same context where in John's Gospel, Jesus proclaims, "I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven." Yes, Jesus takes what we freely offer him. He blesses it, he breaks it, and when he does break it, he reveals something inside and he makes it something that it's not. And then he gives it back to us. Eugene Peterson has pointed out that these verbs, take and break, are the language of generosity, and that the verbs bless and break are the language of sacrifice. That we are called to a Eucharistic life, one of generosity as well as one of sacrifice. That if we are willing to be broken open and given away, that then we begin to participate in the ministry of Jesus. That Jesus himself is calling us to a Eucharistic life, and that a life of compassion transforms us while it transforms the world. Following Jesus is more than following moral teaching. It's about pouring ourselves out for others, being Jesus to the world and bringing Jesus to the world. There is something in here in this story, at least for me, that says that Jesus supplies the resources we need, multiplying what we bring him. Not just our fish and our loaves, but our exhaustion and our weariness. That as we take responsibility for those who are without a shepherd, we find what we need along with rest and refreshment as we follow Jesus. I won't repeat the story for you again. Hopefully you know it by now and could do it yourself. But later in Mark's gospel, on the night that Jesus was betrayed before his impending death on the cross, he gathered with the disciples in the upper room to celebrate the Passover meal. And he took the elements of that meal, the bread and the wine, and he said, "These things represent me. If you nourish yourself on who I am and what I have done for you, you will have all that you need for life and godliness." So he took the bread and he gave thanks. He broke it and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which in a few hours will be broken for you." And then he took the cup and he gave thanks for that too. And he said, "This is the cup of the new and everlasting covenant," meaning that God's love for you will never be taken away, that God's always been for you and has never been against you, for Christ died for the salvation of the world before the foundations of the world. And he invites us to this grand banquet around the Lord's Supper, for he is the host of this meal, and he welcomes us in with all of our rebellion and brokenness and discouragement and hurt. Let us pause and pray. Holy Lord, crucified, risen Christ, we thank you for the offering of yourself on the cross to heal our brokenness. We thank you for this moment, and we ask that you would write the truths of your life on our hearts and through us as we live and follow you. Lord, we thank you for your mercy and your goodness. In this moment, heal us, forgive us, transform us, and multiply us. For your glory, amen.